The morning sun cast long shadows across the Atlantic as Captain David Reed Morehouse raised his spyglass, squinting at the distant vessel that had been trailing the same erratic course for nearly an hour. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, with the way that brigantine moved through the December swells, her sails catching wind, but her helm answering to no human hand. This wasn't just another ship in distress. This was a mystery that would haunt maritime history for over 150 years. December 4th, 1872, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, local time. The Canadian brigantine Dei Gratia cut through moderate seas, roughly 400 nautical miles east of the Azores, off Santa Maria Island. Captain Morehouse had been making good time on his voyage from New York to Gibraltar when his lookout spotted the vessel on the horizon. At first glance, she appeared to be another merchant ship, following a similar route through these well-traveled shipping lanes. But as the distance closed, details emerged that chilled Morehouse to the bone. The ship moved like a drunken sailor, lurching forward under partial sail, then falling off the wind, her bow swinging aimlessly as if guided by ghosts. No figures moved on her deck. No smoke rose from her galley. The silence that surrounded her felt absolute, broken only by the slap of waves against her hull and the mournful creak of rigging that sang to empty air. "Signal her," Morehouse ordered his crew, though something in his gut already knew no answer would come. They fired a cannon, raised flags, shouted across the water until their voices grew hoarse. The mystery ship sailed on, oblivious to their presence, trapped in her own strange dance with wind and current. As Dei Gratia drew closer, Morehouse could make out her name painted across the stern in bold letters, Mary Celeste. His blood ran cold. He knew that ship, knew her captain. Just weeks earlier, Morehouse had shared drinks with Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs in a New York tavern, discussing their respective voyages over the Mediterranean. Briggs had been in high spirits, excited about his cargo of commercial alcohol bound for Genoa and the prospects of good profits from the run. His wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia would be joining him a family voyage that promised both business success and precious time together at sea. Now Mary Celeste drifted before them like a specter, her deck empty of life, her story written in the language of maritime disaster that every sailor learned to read but hoped never to encounter. Morehouse ordered his first mate, Oliver DeVoe, to take 2 crew members and board the derelict vessel. As their small boat approached Mary Celeste's hull, the only sounds were the rhythmic splash of oars and the increasingly loud groaning of the abandoned ship's timbers. The boarding party climbed over the rail and disappeared into the shadows of the deck, their footsteps echoing like drum beats in a cathedral. What they found aboard would challenge every explanation, confound maritime experts, and birth theories that ranged from the plausible to the utterly fantastic. The ship was seaworthy, her hull sound, her cargo intact, her provisions more than adequate for the voyage. But of Captain Briggs, his family, and 7 crew members, there remained not a single trace. Before we dive deeper into this mystery that has puzzled investigators for generations, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. If this story has already grabbed your attention, hit that like button and subscribe, because what we discover next will challenge everything you think you know about what happened aboard Mary Celeste. The boarding party's initial survey revealed a ship caught between order and chaos, as if her crew had vanished in the middle of ordinary shipboard routine. But the deeper DeVoe and his men explored, the more questions arose and the more disturbing the evidence became. What force could make 10 experienced sailors abandon a seaworthy vessel in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? Oliver DeVoe's boots echoed against Mary Celeste's deck planking as he stepped through the main hatch, his lantern casting dancing shadows across the ship's interior, while seawater sloshed ominously somewhere below in the darkness. The silence aboard this ghost ship held secrets that would either solve a maritime mystery or deepen it beyond all comprehension. The first thing DeVoe noticed was the water, roughly 3.5 feet of it, filling the hold, enough to alarm any crew, but nowhere near sufficient to sink a vessel of Mary Celeste's size and tonnage. The sound of it moving with the ship's motion created an eerie rhythm, like a heartbeat in an otherwise lifeless body. His lantern beam revealed something even more unsettling. The cargo of 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol remained perfectly intact, not a single container broken or missing despite whatever calamity had befallen the ship. Moving through the vessel felt like walking through a museum of interrupted lives. In the captain's cabin, DeVoe found personal effects scattered but undisturbed. Sarah Briggs's sewing basket sat open, with thread still wound around a needle, as if she'd been interrupted mid-stitch. Little Sophia's toys lay where a child had left them, including a small wooden doll that would have provided comfort during the long ocean crossing. The ship's papers told a story frozen in time. The last log entry, penned in Captain Briggs's careful handwriting, was dated 8 o'clock in the morning on November 25th, 9 full days before De Gracia's discovery. The position recorded placed Mary Celeste off Santa Maria Island, the same waters where she now drifted like a maritime ghost. Weather observations noted in the log suggested fair conditions, nothing that would have prompted an emergency abandonment. But evidence of sudden departure lay scattered across the deck, like breadcrumbs in a dark fairy tale. The ship's single lifeboat was missing, its davits empty and hanging at angles that suggested hasty launching rather than careful preparation. A makeshift sounding rod fashioned from a rope with a piece of iron tied to the end lay abandoned on the deck, as if someone had been desperately measuring the water in the hold when something forced them to flee. The compass binnacle had shifted from its proper position, its glass cover shattered into fragments that crunched under DeVoe's feet. This wasn't damage from ordinary rough weather. This spoke of panic, of hands desperately trying to navigate while something terrible unfolded around them. The main hatch remained securely battened down, but the fore and lazarette hatches gaped open like wounds, their covers lying on the deck as if thrown aside in haste. Rigging told its own story of chaos. Sails hung in tatters, some missing entirely, while others flapped uselessly in the Atlantic breeze. Sheets and stays trailed over the sides into the ocean, creating a spiderweb of rope that would have made the ship nearly impossible to handle properly. Much of the running rigging hung loose, as if cut deliberately or torn away by some tremendous force. The galley presented perhaps the most haunting scene of all. Cooking implements sat as if the ship's cook had simply stepped away for a moment, pots on the cold stove, utensils clean and ready for the next meal. But a thin layer of salt from seawater spray coated everything, suggesting the galley had been abandoned for days. The provisions that Captain Briggs had carefully calculated for the voyage to Genoa remained largely untouched, enough food and water to sustain 10 people for weeks more. Interior cabins bore the marks of the bilge water that had seeped through skylights and doorways, creating a damp, musty atmosphere that seemed to permeate every wooden beam and fiber of canvas. Yet despite this water damage, personal belongings remained in place. Money lay uncounted in drawers. Valuable navigation instruments sat in their cases. If pirates had taken the crew, why leave behind anything of worth? DeVoe's exploration revealed a ship caught between order and disaster, as if time itself had stopped at the moment of crisis. The evidence suggested a crew that had abandoned their vessel quickly, but not in blind panic. They had taken the lifeboat, which required some coordination and planning, yet left behind everything else that might have sustained them in the open ocean. Standing on Mary Celeste's deck as afternoon shadows lengthened across the Atlantic, DeVoe felt the weight of an impossible puzzle. 10 experienced sailors, including a captain known for his caution and seamanship, had vanished from a seaworthy vessel in calm waters, with adequate provisions and valuable cargo intact. What could have frightened them so completely that death in an open boat seem preferable to remaining aboard their floating sanctuary? The answer would require understanding not just what happened aboard Mary Celeste, but who these missing souls were and what they might have encountered in the vast emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean. Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs stood at the helm of his own ship for the last time on the morning of November 25, 1872, his weathered hands gripping the wheel as he recorded their position in the ship's log with the same meticulous care that had earned him a reputation as one of New England's most reliable merchant captains. The 10 souls who disappeared from Mary Celeste weren't just statistics in a maritime mystery. They were real people with hopes, fears, and futures that vanished into the Atlantic's endless blue. Benjamin Briggs embodied everything the shipping industry valued in a master mariner. At 37 years old, he had spent more than half his life at sea, working his way up from ordinary seaman to captain through skill, determination, and an unbending commitment to the safety of his crew and cargo. Those who knew him described a man who checked and double-checked everything, who never took unnecessary risks, and who treated his ships like extensions of his own body. His decision to bring his family aboard, Mary Celeste, spoke to his confidence in both the vessel and his own abilities. Sarah Elizabeth Briggs, 30 years old and the devoted wife of the captain, had made this voyage not out of obligation, but from a genuine love of the sea that matched her husband's own. She wasn't a delicate landlubber forced to endure ocean travel. Maritime records show she had accompanied Benjamin on previous voyages and proved herself a capable sailor's wife, skilled at managing shipboard life and providing stability for the crew during long months away from home. Her presence aboard Mary Celeste represented a family decision to combine business with the precious commodity of time together. 2-year-old Sophia Matilda Briggs brought light and laughter to the stern atmosphere of a working merchant vessel. Crew members who served under Captain Briggs on other voyages later testified that the little girl had become a beloved mascot, her childish wonder at dolphins and flying fish providing moments of joy during the grinding routine of ocean crossings. She would have been walking steadily by the time Mary Celeste departed New York, probably chattering in the way toddlers do, filling the captain's cabin with domestic sounds that softened the harsh realities of life at sea. The 7 crew members represented a cross-section of experienced merchant sailors, each chosen by Briggs for their proven abilities and reliable character. First, mate Albert Richardson, a German immigrant named Volkert Lorentzen, brothers Bas and Arian Martens from the Netherlands, Gottlieb Gutschall, who served as cook, and Andrew Gilling and Edward William Head, men whose names appear in shipping records as competent sailors with clean records and steady employment histories. These weren't desperate men who might mutiny or panic at the first sign of trouble. Maritime employment records from New York's shipping district show that each had sailed multiple voyages without incident, earning the trust of captains and shipping agents who valued reliability above all else. They were the kind of crew that insurance companies preferred experienced, sober, and skilled enough to handle a merchant vessel worth thousands of dollars. On November 7, 1872, this carefully assembled company departed New York Harbor aboard a ship that represented significant investment and careful preparation. Mary Celeste herself told a story of maritime ambition and American entrepreneurial spirit. Originally built in 1861 at Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, as the brigantine Amazon, she had been purchased, refitted, and renamed by a consortium of New York investors who saw profit in the Mediterranean trade routes. The $10,000 refit completed earlier that year had transformed her into a vessel measuring 103 feet in length, with a beam of 25.7 feet and a depth of 16.2 feet. Her tonnage of 282 tons made her substantial enough to carry profitable cargo loads, while remaining small enough for efficient operation with a minimal crew. The investment in her renovation spoke to confidence in both the ship's capabilities and the skill of Captain Briggs to generate returns for his investors. But money and careful planning couldn't protect against whatever force had swept 10 human beings from Mary Celeste's deck, leaving behind only questions and the terrible silence of empty spaces where life had once thrived. The personal effects found undisturbed in the cabins, Sarah's sewing, Sophia's toys. The crew's few possessions, tucked neatly in their quarters, created a haunting portrait of lives interrupted mid-sentence, as if everyone aboard had simply stepped through a doorway into nothingness. Maritime historians who have studied the case note that the crew's belongings suggested men preparing for a routine voyage, not sailors expecting trouble. Their sea chests contained the usual assortment of clothing, tobacco, letters from home, and small personal treasures that made long ocean crossings bearable. Nothing suggested preparation for emergency abandonment or concern about the ship's seaworthiness. The more investigators learned about the people aboard Mary Celeste, the deeper the mystery became. These weren't reckless adventurers or desperate souls with nothing to lose. They were careful, experienced mariners and a loving family who had every reason to expect a profitable and uneventful voyage to the Mediterranean. What could have convinced Captain Briggs, a man known for his caution and seamanship, that remaining aboard his own vessel posed a greater threat than launching into the Atlantic Ocean in a single lifeboat with his wife, toddler daughter, and 7 crew members? The answer lay not just in what happened aboard Mary Celeste, but in understanding the forces that could drive rational people to choose almost certain death over whatever they encountered in the middle of the ocean. The morning of November 7th, 1872, dawned crisp and clear over New York Harbor as Mary Celeste's crew made their final preparations for departure. The smell of tar and salt water mixing with the acrid smoke from countless steamships, while Captain Briggs conducted his last inspection of a vessel he believed would carry his family safely across the Atlantic. This would be the final time anyone would witness Mary Celeste under normal command, beginning a voyage that started with hope and ended in one of maritime history's most enduring mysteries. The departure itself followed the routine protocols that had governed merchant shipping for generations. Harbor records show Mary Celeste cleared New York's customs house with her cargo, manifest properly filed, listing 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol consigned to H. Mascarenhas Company in Genoa, Italy. The alcohol, a industrial-grade spirit used in manufacturing, represented exactly the kind of profitable cargo that made Mediterranean trade routes attractive to American merchants seeking to expand their markets beyond domestic shipping. Captain Briggs had calculated provisions for the crossing with his characteristic attention to detail. 9 days' worth of food and water might seem minimal for an ocean voyage, but experienced mariners knew that favorable winds could carry a well-handled brigantine from New York to the Straits of Gibraltar in as little as 2 weeks. The provisions represented adequate supplies with a reasonable safety margin, assuming normal weather conditions and no significant delays. As Mary Celeste cleared the harbor and set her course east-southeast toward the Atlantic shipping lanes, she would have presented the picture of maritime efficiency that investors and insurance companies valued. Her rigging drew taut against a favorable breeze. Her hull cut cleanly through the swells, and her experienced crew settled into the watch routines that would govern their lives for the next several weeks. But somewhere between that confident departure and November 25th, 18 days later, something went catastrophically wrong. The ship's log entries, meticulously maintained in Captain Briggs's careful handwriting, provide a window into those crucial weeks before disaster struck. Weather observations noted generally favorable conditions, with the variable winds and moderate seas typical of late autumn North Atlantic crossings. Navigation fixes showed Mary Celeste making steady progress toward her destination, following established shipping routes that thousands of vessels had traveled safely before her. Maritime meteorologists who have studied the weather patterns for late 1872 note that the season presented typical challenges, but nothing extraordinary. November and December Atlantic crossings always carried risks, sudden storms, equipment failures, navigation errors in an era before reliable radio communication. But experienced captains like Briggs knew how to handle such difficulties. His reputation had been built on successfully completing voyages under conditions far more challenging than anything the weather records suggest he encountered. The final log entry, recorded at 8 o'clock on the morning of November 25th, provides the last glimpse into normal shipboard life aboard Mary Celeste. Captain Briggs noted their position as off Santa Maria Island in the Azores, placing the ship roughly where Dei Gratia would find her drifting 9 days later. Wind direction, barometric pressure, and sea conditions all appeared routine. Nothing in the meteorological observations suggested impending disaster. Yet within hours of that final entry, 10 human beings would vanish from a seaworthy vessel, leaving behind a puzzle that has frustrated maritime investigators for more than a century and a half. What happened during those missing hours between the last log entry and whatever catastrophe befell Mary Celeste remains locked in the Atlantic's memory. The physical evidence found aboard the abandoned ship suggests a crisis that developed rapidly, forcing experienced sailors to make desperate choices with inadequate time for careful planning. The missing lifeboat indicated that the crew hadn't simply fallen overboard or been swept away by a rogue wave. They had made a conscious decision to abandon ship. But launching a lifeboat in mid-ocean represented almost certain death for 10 people, including a 2-year-old child. Emergency boats carried minimal supplies and offered little protection against Atlantic weather conditions. Even experienced sailors knew that survival in an open boat measured in days, not weeks, and rescue depended entirely on the slim chance of encountering another vessel in the vast emptiness of the shipping lanes. Captain Briggs would have understood these grim calculations better than anyone. His decision to order abandonment meant that whatever threatened Mary Celeste appeared more dangerous than facing the ocean in a small boat with his wife, daughter, and crew. The nature of that threat, whether natural disaster, human violence, or something else entirely, became the central question that would define the Mary Celeste mystery. The time factor adds another layer of complexity to the puzzle. 9 days elapsed between the last log entry and Dei Gratia's discovery of the abandoned vessel. During this period, Mary Celeste continued sailing under partial canvas, covering an unknown distance while unmanned. Wind patterns and current charts suggest she could have drifted hundreds of miles from her position on November 25th, making it impossible to determine exactly where the crew abandoned ship. Those 9 missing days represent a black hole in maritime history, a period when a fully crewed merchant vessel transformed into a ghost ship, sailing empty seas while carrying her cargo toward a destination she would never reach under human command. What force could have been so terrifying that Captain Benjamin Briggs chose to risk his family's lives in an open boat rather than remain aboard his own ship? The answer would emerge not from the ship herself, but from the legal proceedings that followed her discovery proceedings that would reveal evidence of possible foul play and ignite theories that continue to divide maritime experts to this day. The heavy oak doors of the Gibraltar Admiralty Court swung open on December 17, 1872, as Chief Justice Sir James Cochrane took his seat beneath the Union Jack, his weathered face grave with the knowledge that the case before him would challenge every precedent in maritime salvage law. The fate of Mary Celeste and the mystery of her missing crew now rested in the hands of British colonial justice, where legal procedure would either uncover the truth or bury it beneath layers of bureaucratic doubt. The salvage hearing had been convened to determine a seemingly straightforward matter: how much compensation should Dei Gratia's crew receive for rescuing an abandoned vessel and bringing her safely to port? Under maritime law, such proceedings typically involved routine paperwork and modest financial awards. Ships were abandoned for various reasons: storms, fire, crew illness, and their recovery by other vessels represented an essential part of the ocean's unwritten code of mutual assistance. But from the moment Attorney General Frederick Solly Flood examined the evidence, it became clear that Mary Celeste represented something far more sinister than a routine abandonment case. Solly Flood, a man whose reputation for thoroughness had earned him respect throughout Britain's colonial legal system, approached the investigation with the methodical precision of a detective examining a crime scene. He had handled dozens of maritime cases during his tenure in Gibraltar, but something about Mary Celeste's condition immediately aroused his suspicions. Ships didn't simply empty themselves of human life while leaving cargo, provisions, and personal effects untouched. The Attorney General's examination began with the physical evidence aboard the vessel. Working methodically through each compartment, he noted details that casual observers might have missed. Dark stains on the deck near the main hatch caught his attention, stains that could have been blood, rust, or any number of innocuous substances, but which demanded investigation given the mysterious circumstances. The sword found beneath Captain Briggs's berth showed similar staining, its blade marked with what appeared to be dried blood and strange notches that suggested violent use. But Solly Flood's suspicions extended beyond physical evidence to the timing and circumstances of the discovery itself. He found it remarkably convenient that Captain Morehouse of Dei Gratia should happen upon Mary Celeste in the vast Atlantic Ocean, particularly given that both vessels had departed New York within days of each other, and both captains were known to be acquainted. The mathematical probability of such an encounter in the trackless ocean struck him as suspiciously low. The salvage claim itself raised additional questions. Under normal circumstances, rescuing a derelict vessel entitled the salvers to a percentage of the ship and cargo's value, typically 10 to 20% for routine salvage operations. But Dei Gratia's crew was claiming rights to a vessel worth approximately $46,000, a sum that represented enormous wealth in 1872. The financial incentive for orchestrating Mary Celeste's abandonment would have been substantial. During testimony, Solly Flood pressed Captain Morehouse and his crew for detailed accounts of their discovery. Their stories remained consistent under questioning, but the Attorney General noted subtle inconsistencies in timing and positioning that suggested possible coordination. Why had Morehouse waited several hours before boarding the derelict vessel? Why had his crew been so quick to assume that Mary Celeste was completely abandoned rather than simply undermanned due to illness or accident? The condition of Mary Celeste's rigging provided another puzzle piece that troubled the investigation. Experienced sailors testified that the damage to sails and running gear appeared inconsistent with storm damage or normal wear. Some cuts looked deliberate, as if someone had systematically disabled the ship's ability to sail efficiently. Yet other equipment remained in perfect condition, creating a pattern that suggested human intervention rather than natural forces. Oliver DeVoe, who had led the boarding party from Dei Gratia, faced particularly intense questioning about his actions aboard the abandoned vessel. Solly Flood noted that DeVoe had made remarkably quick work of assessing the ship's condition and preparing her for the voyage to Gibraltar. For a man supposedly encountering an unknown vessel for the first time, he had demonstrated surprising familiarity with Mary Celeste's layout and systems. The cargo of denatured alcohol presented its own mystery. 1,701 barrels remained perfectly intact, with no evidence of piracy or theft. Pirates seeking valuable cargo would hardly have ignored such a substantial haul. Yet whoever had been responsible for the crew's disappearance had left the alcohol untouched. This suggested either perpetrators with no interest in financial gain, or criminals sophisticated enough to understand that stealing the cargo would immediately expose their involvement. Weather records for the period between Mary Celeste's departure and discovery showed generally favorable conditions, undermining theories that severe storms had forced the crew to abandon ship. Maritime meteorologists consulted by the court confirmed that no significant weather events had occurred in the shipping lanes during the crucial period, leaving unexplained why experienced sailors would have chosen to risk their lives in an open boat. As testimony continued over several weeks, Solly Flood became increasingly convinced that the evidence pointed toward deliberate criminal action. The careful preservation of valuable cargo, the suspicious timing of the discovery, and the physical evidence aboard the vessel all suggested a conspiracy involving multiple parties. In his formal statement to the court, he declared that the evidence inexorably pointed to foul play, though he acknowledged that proving criminal activity would require more evidence than the investigation had uncovered. The Attorney General's conclusion sent shockwaves through the maritime community. If Mary Celeste represented a criminal conspiracy rather than a maritime disaster, it suggested that the ocean's traditional codes of honor and mutual assistance could be corrupted by greed and violence. Insurance companies, shipping agents, and sea captains throughout the Atlantic trade routes suddenly found themselves questioning whether other routine salvage operations might mask similar criminal enterprises. But Solly Flood's investigation also revealed the limitations of 18th century forensic science and legal procedure. Without modern methods for analyzing physical evidence, distinguishing between blood and rust stains remained largely a matter of educated guesswork. Maritime law provided no framework for investigating complex criminal conspiracies that spanned multiple vessels and jurisdictions. The Gibraltar hearing established that something extraordinary had happened aboard Mary Celeste, but it could not determine exactly what that something was or who might have been responsible. What specific evidence had convinced Attorney General Solly Flood that the missing crew had been victims of foul play rather than maritime disaster? The answer lay in details that would emerge from witness testimony and expert analysis, details that would either support the conspiracy theory or reveal alternative explanations for Mary Celeste's mysterious abandonment. The afternoon sun slanted through the courtroom windows as maritime expert Captain R.W. Schufelt held up the stained cutlass found beneath Captain Briggs's berth, its blade catching the light while revealing dark streaks that had dried into the metal like accusations written in rust and shadow. Every piece of physical evidence from Mary Celeste told a story, but whether that story was one of murder, natural disaster, or something else entirely would determine the fate of everyone connected to the mystery. The sword itself became a focal point of Attorney General Solly Flood's investigation, representing the most tangible evidence that violence might have occurred aboard the abandoned vessel. Under careful examination, the blade showed multiple stains and several fresh notches along its cutting-edge damage that suggested recent use in circumstances far removed from normal shipboard maintenance. Captain Schufelt, whose expertise in maritime weapons was recognized throughout the Royal Navy, testified that the pattern of nicks and stains was consistent with the cutlass having been used as a weapon rather than a tool. But the sword raised as many questions as it answered. Why would Captain Briggs, a man known for his peaceful disposition and excellent relationship with his crews, have needed to draw a weapon aboard his own ship? Maritime records showed no history of disciplinary problems or violent incidents involving any of the crew members who had sailed aboard Mary Celeste. The presence of his wife and 2-year-old daughter also argued against the likelihood of a violent confrontation that would have required armed intervention. The dark stains found on the deck near the main hatch presented another puzzle that defied easy explanation. Chemical analysis in 1872 lacked the sophistication to definitively identify the substance, but experienced sailors who examined the marks testified that they resembled dried blood more than any other common shipboard material. The stains formed a pattern that suggested something had been dragged across the deck, leaving a trail that led toward the rail where the missing lifeboat had been launched. Yet the absence of bodies or additional evidence of violence undermined the murder theory. If pirates or mutineers had killed Captain Briggs, his family, and loyal crew members, where were the remains? The Atlantic Ocean could certainly swallow evidence, but criminals sophisticated enough to dispose of 10 bodies without leaving additional traces seemed unlikely to have overlooked valuable cargo or failed to clean obvious bloodstains from the deck. The broken compass binnacle provided another piece of the evidentiary puzzle that frustrated investigators. The glass cover lay shattered across the deck, and the compass itself had been knocked from its proper position, damage that spoke of either violent struggle or desperate panic. Navigation instruments represented the most critical equipment aboard any sailing vessel, and experienced sailors treated them with religious reverence. Only extreme circumstances would have justified the rough handling that had destroyed Mary Celeste's primary compass. Dr. J. Patron, a Gibraltar physician consulted to examine the physical evidence, offered a more disturbing interpretation of the ship's condition. He noted that the fore and lazarette hatches had been thrown open with their covers scattered on deck, creating access to the ship's interior that would have been unnecessary during normal operations. The pattern suggested either a frantic search for something hidden in the ship's depths or an attempt to ventilate spaces that had become dangerous due to gas accumulation or fire. The cargo itself provided crucial clues about what might have happened during Mary Celeste's final hours under human command. Denatured alcohol, while valuable, presented specific hazards that every merchant captain understood. The industrial spirit was highly flammable and could produce toxic vapors under certain conditions, vapors that might have threatened the crew's safety even without an actual fire or explosion. 9 barrels in the forward hold showed signs of seepage, their contents having leaked into the bilge and created an atmosphere that could have turned deadly with the right combination of heat and confined space. Captain James Winchester, part owner of Mary Celeste, testified about the extensive safety precautions that had been implemented during the cargo loading process. The barrels had been carefully inspected, properly secured, and loaded according to established protocols for transporting hazardous materials. Yet maritime experts acknowledged that alcohol vapors could accumulate unpredictably, particularly in rough weather, that might cause the barrels to shift and develop leaks. The waterspout theory emerged as one of the most plausible explanations for the crew's sudden abandonment of their vessel. Several experienced captains testified that freak weather phenomena could develop rapidly in Atlantic waters, creating conditions that might convince even seasoned sailors to take desperate measures. A waterspout approaching Mary Celeste could have created the appearance of imminent disaster, prompting Captain Briggs to order immediate evacuation while the ship remained fundamentally seaworthy. But the waterspout explanation struggled to account for the specific pattern of evidence found aboard the abandoned vessel. Weather-related emergencies typically left signatures of storm damage, torn sails, broken spars, equipment scattered by high winds. Mary Celeste's condition suggested a more controlled evacuation, as if the crew had time to secure some hatches while leaving others deliberately open. The alcohol vapor theory gained credibility as maritime chemists explained how industrial spirits could create invisible dangers that might not become apparent until too late. If concentrated vapors had begun accumulating in the ship's holds, the first symptoms, headaches, disorientation, breathing difficulties, might have convinced Captain Briggs that his family and crew faced imminent poisoning. The decision to abandon ship would have seemed rational under such circumstances, even if subsequent ventilation had cleared the dangerous atmosphere. Yet this explanation also required accepting that 10 experienced people had chosen almost certain death in an open boat over remaining aboard a vessel where they could have simply moved to the upper deck until the danger passed. The mathematics of survival strongly favored staying with the ship, even in the presence of toxic vapors that could be avoided through proper ventilation and deck-level positioning. As the Gibraltar hearing continued, each piece of evidence seemed to support multiple theories, while definitively proving none of them. The physical condition of Mary Celeste told a story of sudden crisis and desperate decision-making, but the specific nature of that crisis remained locked in the silence of empty cabins and abandoned cargo holds. What other explanation could account for the peculiar combination of careful preservation and obvious panic that characterized every aspect of Mary Celeste's condition? The answer would come not from official investigation or expert testimony, but from the imagination of a struggling young doctor who would transform maritime mystery into literary legend, and in doing so, obscure the truth behind layers of fiction that persist to this day. In the spring of 1884, a struggling young physician named Arthur Conan Doyle sat at his desk in Portsmouth, England, crafting a fictional account that would transform Mary Celeste from a maritime mystery into a cultural phenomenon. His pen scratching across paper as he wove fact and fantasy into a narrative that would captivate readers while burying the truth beneath layers of literary invention. This wasn't just another magazine story. This was the moment when reality surrendered to imagination, creating a legend that would outlive every factual investigation. Doyle's tale, titled J. Habakkuk Jephson's Statement, appeared in the January 1884 issue of Cornhill magazine, one of Britain's most prestigious literary publications. The young doctor, still years away from creating Sherlock Holmes, had seized upon the Mary Celeste mystery as raw material for a story that would showcase his talent for weaving compelling narratives from mysterious circumstances. But in transforming maritime fact into literary fiction, he would fundamentally alter how the world understood what had happened aboard the abandoned brigantine. The fictional account presented itself as the true testimony of J. Habakkuk Jephson, supposedly the sole survivor of Mary Celeste's voyage, who had remained hidden during the real investigation to protect himself from those responsible for the tragedy. Doyle's narrator described a conspiracy involving religious fanaticism, racial hatred, and ritualistic murder elements designed to thrill Victorian readers who craved exotic dangers and foreign intrigue. In Doyle's version, Mary Celeste became the Marie Celeste, a subtle change that would persist in popular culture for decades. The ship's cargo transformed from mundane industrial alcohol into a more dramatic mixture that included valuable artifacts. Captain Briggs evolved from a careful New England merchant mariner into a character caught in an international conspiracy involving secret societies and ancient vengeances. Most significantly, Doyle introduced elements that had never appeared in the actual investigation: mysterious passengers, hidden enemies, and elaborate plots that stretched from America to North Africa. His fictional Jephson described witnessing the systematic murder of the ship's company by conspirators who had infiltrated the crew, leaving only himself alive through a combination of luck and the protection of a mysterious black stone that held significance for his captors. The story's impact exceeded anything Doyle had anticipated. Victorian readers, hungry for adventure narratives that combined mystery with exotic locations, embraced J. Habakkuk Jephson's Statement as a masterpiece of suspenseful storytelling. The tale was reprinted in newspapers across Britain and America, translated into multiple languages, and adapted for stage performances that brought the Mary Celeste mystery to audiences who had never heard of the original incident. But Doyle's fictional success created an unexpected problem. Many readers believed they were reading a factual account rather than a work of imagination. The story's presentation as a survivor's testimony, combined with its detailed references to real people and places, convinced numerous readers that Jephson had actually existed and that his account revealed the truth behind Mary Celeste's mystery. Newspapers began reporting Doyle's fictional elements as if they were newly discovered facts, while the original Gibraltar investigation records gathered dust in maritime archives. The confusion between fact and fiction deepened when American newspapers began publishing their own versions of the Mary Celeste story, often incorporating elements from Doyle's tale while claiming to present factual reports. The ship's name became permanently corrupted to Marie Celeste in popular usage, while details like mysterious passengers and exotic cargo became accepted as historical fact, despite having no basis in the original investigation. Within a decade of Doyle's story's publication, the real Mary Celeste had become almost impossible to separate from its fictional counterpart. maritime historians found themselves fighting a losing battle against popular misconceptions that had taken root in the public imagination. The careful testimony given during the Gibraltar hearings, with its focus on alcohol vapors, weather conditions, and routine salvage procedures, seemed mundane compared to Doyle's tale of murder and conspiracy. The transformation of Mary Celeste from maritime mystery to popular legend reflected broader changes in how Victorian society consumed information about distant events. As literacy rates increased and popular magazines reached wider audiences, the boundary between factual reporting and entertaining fiction became increasingly blurred. Readers wanted stories that provided clear explanations for mysterious events, even if those explanations required abandoning the messy ambiguities of real investigation. Doyle himself seemed surprised by the lasting impact of his fictional account. In later interviews, he acknowledged that the story had been pure invention, designed to entertain rather than inform, but by then, the damage to historical accuracy had been done. Popular understanding of the Mary Celeste mystery had become permanently shaped by fictional elements that bore no relationship to what had actually happened aboard the abandoned brigantine. The success of J. Habakkuk Jeffson's statement also established a template for how future writers would approach maritime mysteries. The combination of exotic locations, hidden conspiracies, and sole survivors became standard elements in sea stories, while the careful documentation and scientific analysis that characterized real maritime investigation seemed boring by comparison. Fiction had proven more compelling than fact, and popular culture embraced the more dramatic version. As the 1880s progressed, Mary Celeste began appearing in other fictional works, each adding new layers of invention to the original mystery. Penny dreadfuls, theatrical productions, and illustrated magazines all contributed their own versions of what had happened aboard the abandoned ship, creating a mythology that grew increasingly distant from the historical record. The phenomenon surrounding Mary Celeste demonstrated how quickly historical events could be transformed into popular entertainment, especially when the original facts remained incomplete or ambiguous. Doyle's fictional account filled the gaps in human knowledge with dramatic explanations that satisfied the public desire for resolution, even at the cost of historical accuracy. But what happened when other writers and investigators tried to separate fact from fiction and discover what had really occurred during those missing 9 days in November 1872? The search for truth would lead down increasingly complex paths as new theories emerged, each competing with Doyle's influential fiction and with each other to explain the enduring mystery of the ghost ship that had captured the world's imagination. The decades following Arthur Conan Doyle's fictional intervention spawned a cottage industry of Mary Celeste theorists, each convinced they had discovered the one true explanation that had eluded maritime investigators, insurance companies, and naval experts for generations. Yet every new theory seemed to raise more questions than it answered. In the battle between fact and speculation, the truth about Mary Celeste's missing crew became increasingly elusive, buried beneath layers of conjecture that reflected more about human nature than maritime history. The alcohol vapor theory emerged as one of the most scientifically credible explanations, championed by maritime chemists who understood the specific dangers posed by Mary Celeste's cargo. Dr. M.O.4, Andrea Sella, a chemistry professor who studied the case in the 20th century, demonstrated how denatured alcohol could produce explosive vapors under the right conditions. The 9 barrels that showed signs of seepage could have created a volatile atmosphere in the ship's forward holds, particularly if temperature changes caused the liquid to expand and breach the containers. Captain Briggs would have understood these dangers intimately. Maritime regulations of the 1870s required specific precautions when transporting flammable cargo, including careful ventilation and prohibition of open flames near storage areas. If alcohol vapors had begun accumulating to dangerous levels, the captain might have ordered the crew to open the forward hatches for ventilation. explaining why those covers were found scattered on deck, while the main cargo hatch remained securely battened. The decision to abandon ship could have followed a terrifying discovery that vapor concentrations had reached explosive levels. Even without an actual fire or explosion, the mere presence of such vapors would have created a floating bomb that could detonate from the smallest spark. Captain Briggs, responsible for his family's safety and the lives of his crew, might have concluded that launching the lifeboat represented their only chance of survival. But the vapor theory struggled to explain why the crew hadn't simply remained on deck until the dangerous atmosphere cleared. Alcohol vapors, being heavier than air, would have concentrated in the ship's lower compartments, while leaving the upper deck relatively safe. Experienced sailors knew that patience and proper ventilation could resolve such problems without requiring the desperate measure of abandoning ship entirely. Insurance fraud emerged as another persistent theory, particularly given the substantial sums involved in Mary Celeste's ownership and cargo. The ship's complex ownership structure, involving multiple investors and maritime partnerships, created financial incentives that some investigators found suspicious. Captain Winchester's decision to heavily insure both vessel and cargo shortly before departure raised questions about whether the voyage had been planned as an elaborate fraud scheme. Proponents of the fraud theory pointed to the convenient timing of Degrasse's discovery and the previous relationship between Captains Morehouse and Briggs. The mathematical probability of two acquainted captains encountering each other in the vast Atlantic Ocean struck some observers as remarkably low. If the abandonment had been staged, the conspirators could have arranged for a friendly vessel to discover Mary Celeste and claim salvage rights, splitting the profits among those involved in the deception. Yet the fraud theory required accepting that Captain Briggs would have sacrificed his wife and 2-year-old daughter for financial gain, a proposition that contradicted everything known about his character and reputation. Maritime records showed him to be scrupulously honest in his business dealings, and contemporary accounts described a devoted family man who would never have risked his loved ones' lives for money. Piracy theories gained traction among those who believed Attorney General Solly Flood's conclusions about foul play. The Mediterranean shipping routes were known to harbor criminals who preyed on merchant vessels, particularly those carrying valuable cargo, like Mary Celeste's alcohol shipment. Pirates might have overwhelmed the crew, murdered the passengers, and then abandoned the ship when they discovered the cargo was industrial alcohol rather than drinking spirits. This explanation accounted for the evidence of violence, the blood-stained sword, the dark stains on deck, the obvious signs of struggle in the compass binnacle area. Pirates operating in 1872 often showed little interest in preserving ships or cargo if their primary goal was robbery and murder. The decision to leave the valuable alcohol untouched might have reflected disappointment that the barrels didn't contain the rum or wine they had expected. But piracy theories faced the same problem that plagued the murder hypothesis: the complete absence of bodies or additional evidence of criminal activity. Pirates brutal enough to kill 10 people, including a small child, seemed unlikely to have disposed of the evidence so thoroughly, while leaving obvious bloodstains and weapons behind for investigators to discover. Natural disaster theories focused on the unpredictable weather phenomena that could develop rapidly in Atlantic waters. Waterspouts, freak waves, and sudden storms had been responsible for numerous maritime disasters during the Age of Sail. A massive waterspout approaching Mary Celeste might have convinced Captain Briggs that his ship faced imminent destruction, prompting an emergency evacuation that proved unnecessary when the weather system passed without causing significant damage. Seismic activity provided another natural explanation for the crew's disappearance. Underwater earthquakes could create conditions that made ships behave erratically, producing sounds and sensations that might convince sailors their vessel was breaking apart. The psychological impact of feeling solid deck planking vibrate and hearing mysterious groaning from the ship's structure could have triggered panic that led to premature abandonment. Modern investigators have proposed even more exotic theories involving rogue waves, magnetic anomalies, and atmospheric phenomena that weren't understood in the 19th century. Each new scientific discovery has generated fresh attempts to explain Mary Celeste's mystery, using contemporary knowledge about oceanography, meteorology, and maritime physics. The proliferation of theories reflects humanity's fundamental discomfort with unsolved mysteries, particularly those involving ordinary people who vanished without explanation. Every generation has approached the Mary Celeste case with the confidence that modern knowledge and scientific methods would finally reveal what 18th century investigators had missed. Yet the core mystery has remained stubbornly resistant to definitive explanation. The challenge facing any serious investigation lies in separating genuine evidence from the fictional elements introduced by Doyle and subsequent storytellers. After more than a century of speculation, myth, and literary embellishment, determining what actually happened aboard Mary Celeste requires first identifying what evidence can be trusted and what represents later invention. But perhaps the most important question isn't which specific theory explains Mary Celeste's mystery, but what the enduring fascination with this case reveals about humanity's relationship with the unknown. What is it about 10 missing souls and an empty ship that continues to capture imaginations more than 150 years after Captain Morehouse first spotted that brigantine sailing unmanned through Atlantic waters? 153 years after Captain David Reed Morehouse first raised his spyglass to examine that strange vessel sailing empty through Atlantic waters, Mary Celeste continues her voyage through human imagination, forever trapped between the known facts of maritime history and the unknowable truth of what happened during those 9 missing days in November 1872. The enduring power of this mystery lies not in what we can prove, but in what we can never know, and in humanity's refusal to accept that some questions may remain forever unanswered. Modern maritime investigators, armed with forensic science, computer modeling, and detailed oceanographic data, have re-examined every aspect of the Mary Celeste case with tools that 19th century investigators could never have imagined. Satellite weather reconstruction has mapped the atmospheric conditions during the crucial period. Chemical analysis has provided definitive identification of the stains found aboard the vessel. Archaeological examination of similar ships has revealed new insights into how cargo shifts and structural stress might have affected the brigantine's behavior. Yet, for all these technological advances, the fundamental mystery remains as impenetrable as ever. We know that 10 people vanished from a seaworthy vessel under circumstances that defied every logical explanation available to experienced maritime professionals. We know that Captain Benjamin Briggs, a man whose reputation for caution and competence was unquestioned, made the desperate decision to abandon his ship while carrying his wife and 2-year-old daughter into almost certain death in an open boat. What we don't know, what we may never know, is why the alcohol vapor theory remains the most scientifically credible explanation, supported by maritime chemistry and the specific evidence found aboard Mary Celeste. The 9 leaking barrels could have created a volatile atmosphere that convinced Captain Briggs his ship had become a floating bomb. The decision to evacuate might have seemed rational in the face of what appeared to be imminent explosion, even if subsequent events proved the danger to be temporary or manageable. Yet this explanation requires accepting that experienced sailors chose death over patience, abandoning a vessel that remained fundamentally safe for the slim hope of survival in an Atlantic lifeboat. The mathematics of maritime survival strongly favored staying with the ship, even in the presence of dangerous vapors that could be managed through proper ventilation and deck-level positioning. The human element of the Mary Celeste mystery may be more important than any physical evidence or scientific theory. Captain Briggs wasn't just a skilled mariner making calculated decisions about ship safety. He was a husband and father whose choices were influenced by love, fear, and the terrible responsibility of protecting his family. The presence of Sarah and Sophia Briggs aboard Mary Celeste transformed every decision from a matter of maritime procedure into a question of personal survival. Perhaps the key to understanding what happened lies not in the technical details of alcohol vapors or weather conditions, but in the psychology of a man who found himself responsible for the lives of those he loved most. If Captain Briggs believed rightly or wrongly that remaining aboard Mary Celeste posed a greater threat to his family than facing the Atlantic Ocean in a lifeboat, his decision becomes comprehensible even if the specific nature of the threat remains unknown. The Mary Celeste mystery has transcended its origins as a maritime incident to become a cultural touchstone that reflects humanity's relationship with the unknown. Each generation has approached the case with confidence that contemporary knowledge would finally solve what previous investigators had missed. Yet the mystery has proven remarkably resistant to definitive explanation. This persistence suggests that our fascination with Mary Celeste stems from something deeper than mere curiosity about historical events. In an age when satellite tracking and radio communication make it nearly impossible for ships to simply vanish, Mary Celeste represents a reminder of how recently human beings lived with genuine mystery. The vast Atlantic Ocean of 1872 was still largely unexplored and unpredictable, a realm where ships could disappear without trace, and where the boundary between the known and unknown remained frighteningly thin. The case also speaks to our fundamental desire for closure and explanation in a universe that often provides neither. The physical evidence found aboard Mary Celeste tells a story of interrupted lives and desperate decisions, but it cannot reveal the thoughts and fears of the 10 people who vanished into history. Their silence has become part of the mystery's enduring power, creating a void that human imagination continually tries to fill. Arthur Conan Doyle's fictional intervention demonstrates how quickly historical fact can be overwhelmed by dramatic narrative when the truth proves insufficient to satisfy human curiosity. The success of J. Habakkuk Jeffson's statement showed that audiences preferred satisfying fiction to ambiguous reality, a preference that continues to shape how the Mary Celeste story is told and understood. Modern popular culture has embraced Mary Celeste as a symbol of maritime mystery, incorporating the case into everything from supernatural documentaries to science fiction films that propose increasingly exotic explanations for the crew's disappearance. Each new interpretation adds another layer to the mythology, while moving further from the historical record, creating a palimpsest where fact and fiction have become inextricably intertwined. The real Mary Celeste, the merchant brigantine that carried 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol from New York toward Genoa in November 1872, has become almost secondary to the legend she inspired. Yet, it's worth remembering that behind the mystery were real people whose lives ended in the Atlantic's cold embrace. Benjamin and Sarah Briggs, little Sophia who would never see her 3rd birthday, and 7 crew members whose names have been preserved only because they vanished. Their fate reminds us that the ocean, for all our technological mastery, remains fundamentally alien to human life. The Atlantic that swallowed Mary Celeste's crew continues to claim vessels and lives, though modern communication systems ensure that such disappearances no longer generate the kind of enduring mystery that has made Mary Celeste immortal. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of the Mary Celeste case. Not that maritime mysteries can be solved through careful investigation and scientific analysis, but that some aspects of human experience will always remain beyond our ability to fully understand or explain. The ghost ship sails on through history, carrying her cargo of questions toward a destination she will never reach. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.